Hello and welcome to this Personnel Today webinar brought to you in association with Expert HR. Today we're looking at what is potentially the biggest legislative change for employers in recent years, shared parental leave. The right to be introduced for parents of babies born next April, which means the mother can essentially transfer her maternity leave and pay to her partner. We'll find out some more details of exactly how it's going to work. If you thought that April 2015 is still a long way off, just consider that the first parents eligible for shared parental leave will know that they're expecting early next month and will soon be knocking on HR's door to find out what they're entitled to. I'm delighted to be joined by Audrey Williams and Camilla Palmer, two experts in this field, and over the next hour we'll be looking at some of the detail of new regulations and the potential impact and what that means for employers. I'm Rob Moss, editor of Personnel Today, and as usual you can submit your questions or comments you may have as we go along in the chat pane on the left-hand side of your screen, but we'll save your questions up for the Q&A at the end of the presentation. We are recording the webinar and we aim to provide a copy of that recording by the end of the week. And first of all, let me just introduce our guests. The bulk of today's slides will be presented by Audrey Williams, a partner in Evershed's Human Resources practice and head of its discrimination law team. Audrey has a wealth of experience advising clients on a range of diversity issues and assists employers in providing training to establish these policies in the workplace. Audrey will go into some of the detail of shared parental leave, and then we'll welcome Camilla Palmer, Chief Executive of the charity Your Employment Settlement Service, or YES, which provides affordable legal advice to employees to resolve workplace disputes without litigation. Camilla has nearly 20 years employment experience, particularly around parental rights, about which she's written a number of books. Camilla's presentation will look at the broader context of shared parental leave and emerging trends of mothers and fathers in the UK workforce. Okay, so before we listen to Audrey, we've got a lot to get through, but I think a good way to start will be to ask the audience a poll in terms of how prepared you are. So you can start voting in this poll now. There's 5 options. How well prepared is your organisation for the introduction of shared parental leave? Please do vote away, and I can see most of you are doing that already. Okay, and we'll move on to the results as they're coming in. And we can see that most are opting for the neither well nor poorly prepared. Very diplomatic choice, but interesting to see only 1% believe that they're very well prepared, and indeed 27% or so saying they're either poorly or very poorly prepared. With that, I will hand over to Audrey, who's going to hopefully change that so that you feel a bit more prepared about what's in the pipeline. Over to you, Audrey.
Thank you, Rob, and useful to have those results. If you'd all clicked on the very well prepared, I think I'd have packed up and gone home and be confident that you're familiar with these new provisions. So what I'm going to do over the next part of the webinar is really just take everyone through the framework and the way in which this new set of leave provisions will operate. It's worth saying at the moment that we haven't got the final regulations, but we are expecting them hopefully within the next 4 or 5 weeks. And indeed, what I am going to take you through is a summary and overview of the rights. Some of the provisions are quite complicated, but in fact what we've got are 6 core regulations that are currently in draft and near finalisation. There's a total, we think, of 16 regulations because there will be other minor amendments to be made to existing maternity rights, shared and other rights around paternity and parental leave. But let's just very quickly remind ourselves of where we are currently, because that will help us just to headline what's going to change. So as you already know, maternity leave at the moment, it's a right to take up to 52 weeks leave. It's a day one right. I don't need qualifying service. And we've got the special regime and provisions about having the right to return to the job that the individual held on no less favourable terms and conditions. And that is certainly going to be mirrored in a slightly different way under the new provisions. You've got the paternity leave provisions of 2 weeks that have to be taken consecutively, again as a maximum, and the newest of these provisions currently in place, additional paternity leave. That's what I describe as the ability of a partner to swap and take some of the mother's maternity leave, and that's from the 20th week. It's conditional on the mother returning to work and would entitle an individual to take up to 26 weeks absence. Now, the additional paternity leave provision, that swapping provision, is going to be repealed with the introduction of shared parental leave. But bear in mind, this new shared parental leave will only apply to babies who are due on or after the 5th of April next year. So what you may find is that you have, for a period, the two regimes running side by side. So anyone already entitled to additional paternity leave will retain that right. And if they then have a new baby born after the 5th of April next year, they will be into the new regime. And we've got some changes coming to the parental leave provisions, which I've just set out there for completeness. The adoption leave regime is also going to change. So at the moment it's conditional on an individual having at least 26 weeks service. It is also an entitlement to 26 weeks to 52 weeks leave. Well, that's the provision that it provides. And there is an entitlement at the moment to 39 weeks pay where you're taking adoption leave. And what we are doing essentially is moving adoption leave so it is much more similar to maternity as currently drafted and the new shared parental leave rights. So I'm going to be focusing mostly on shared parental leave, but bear in mind that very similar provisions apply for adopters. So there will be in future a right to take shared adoption leave as between the primary and secondary adopter. And it will also become a day one right, and they will introduce also the entitlement to pay, which is going to change so that in future it will be 90% of adoption pay for the first 6 weeks, and then moving across to the flat rate. The new regime, as I mentioned, I just want to start firstly with the immediate change, because there are some changes coming in, not next April, but actually this October. And they're quite important changes, although hopefully won't have too significant an impact. And the first change is that partners, and I'll come on in a moment to who is defined as a partner, but in effect this is really looking at new fathers. It could be the mother's partner if that's a stepfather, but that individual, that partner, will have a right to take up to 2 periods of time off to attend antenatal appointments, which will be unpaid. So that is a new provision that's being introduced. From April next year, a very similar time off right is going to be introduced and given to adopters, but we think that's going to be March rather than this October, and it will allow a principal adopter to take up to 5 paid adoption appointments as time off, and co-adopters to take, like a father or a partner, 2 adoption appointments which will be unpaid. The second immediate right that's going to come in, we think in October, on the implementation of these provisions and the regulations, is a set of protection around not being subjected to a detriment and indeed not being dismissed for relying upon these new rights. In particular, not being subjected to a detriment for taking, for example, the time off to attend the antenatal appointments. But of course you may have individuals who are beginning to talk to colleagues or their manager about their plans for next year. Those individuals who are just falling pregnant now actually will start thinking about these new rights and gain that entitlement. So they may start talking about taking time off, and they will therefore have these rights not to be subjected to a detriment for seeking to rely upon their provisions and these new entitlements. So let us dive into what does the new regime actually look like and how will it operate. First of all, the overview of what is going to happen in terms of the time off rights. So as I've already said, it will apply to all babies that are due on or after the 5th of April of next year. That would include, for example, a baby that is due after the 5th of April but actually arrives early, because you're looking at the due date and the expected date of the birth, and it's a very clear, very defined cut-off point. It extends also, as I've said, to adoptions, and the shared adoption leave applies for any child who's matched for adoption on or after the 5th of April next year. There's also an extension of rights to children born to surrogate parents, and what they are saying in that circumstance is certain surrogate parents and surrogacies will gain this right to shared parental leave where the parents are entitled to apply for a parental leave order. So it's not necessarily all surrogates, but certainly where that is the legal entitlement. That's defined by reference to the human embryology legislation. But a child who is going to arrive as a result of surrogacy arrangements on or after the 5th of April, again, these new rights will apply to that category. There is still the protection of compulsory maternity leave. And what that means is that mothers will not be able to share the minimum 2 weeks, or if they work in a factory and it's a 4-week compulsory period, that is still going to stay exclusive to the mother. But the rest of the leave, which could be up to 50 weeks, or indeed 48 if the compulsory leave is 4 weeks, the parents can share. The mother actually gets the option to share the balance of her maternity leave with the partner or the father. And it is really important to bear in mind that in sharing that leave, what a mother is doing is saying, I'm going to discontinue my maternity leave, I'm going to curtail it, and I'm going to opt into the new shared parental leave regime. As I've already mentioned, the additional paternity leave provisions will be abolished, and the statutory adoption leave and the sharing of that, which will become, particularly for the primary adopter, the right to time off, will become a day one right. A couple of things just to mention in this context in terms of how it looks as a period of shared leave. It is possible, because of the way the system has been modelled, for parents, for the mother and the partner, to take shared parental leave and be absent from work at the same time. It is also possible to stop and start shared parental leave. So unlike maternity leave, which is, of course, unless a mother comes into work on a few kit days, generally it's one period of leave, which can be up to 52 weeks. There are some limited ways, and it's usually likely to be up to 3 occasions, whereby each parent can take some shared parental leave, come back to work, and then opt to take some further shared parental leave at a later point. All of the leave, however, between them must be taken by the child's first birthday. And the idea behind this is to enable parents to really take this leave in a flexible way. So the other point to bear in mind is, because this is about opting out of and ending maternity leave and opting into the shared parental leave, with a bit of planning, what may happen is that mother may continue for a period on her maternity leave, tell you when she's going to end that maternity leave at some point in the future, and have the father or the partner actually starting that shared parental leave and their entitlement whilst mother remains off on maternity leave. So it's possible to run some shared parental leave whilst the end of the maternity leave for the mother is still being run. So that's the headline in terms of what it's going to look like. I want to move on now to just talk a little bit about who is going to get these new rights. What's the eligibility and the entitlement? So the first thing to say is that for an individual to be entitled to shared parental leave, there will be a service requirement and there will be an economic test. The principles eligibility is that the parent that wants to take the shared parental leave has to have 26 weeks service with their employer by the end of the 15th week, i.e. the EWC, which is a concept we'll be familiar with under the maternity regime. The parent taking the leave must also have a working partner. And it's quite important to remember here that your employee must satisfy the 26 weeks service, for example, but they have to also confirm to you that their partner, with whom they're going to share the leave, actually meets what's called the economic activity test. And under the regulations, it's actually called the employment and earnings test. The idea behind this is that the government were very keen to enable parents who were actively contributing to the economy to benefit from these rights. So if I'm the mother, I've got my 26-week service. What I have to actually confirm in order to share my leave with my partner is I need to confirm to you as my employer that my partner is either employed or self-employed. So it's not just employees that it's necessarily limited to in terms of entitlement, that they've been employed or self-employed for 26 weeks in the last 66 before the EWC, and that they have earnings of at least £30 per week in the last 13 of those 26 weeks. So it sounds really complicated. It's not straightforward, particularly when you look at the monetary elements and the timescales. There will be an online tool to help employers and indeed individuals with that calculation. The other thing that's worth saying is that when you get notification that a mother's going to opt into this new system, they will confirm to you that their partner meets this test by giving you a form, which is a declaration confirming their partner meets the earnings level. You are not expected to go off and check the economic criteria and details that have been provided. You will be entitled to rely upon the information that has been disclosed to you. There's a second issue then, which is about who can the mother actually share the entitlement with. And you can see the list here. Obviously it talks about the child's father, the mother's husband or civil partner, or a partner living in an enduring family relationship. What the provisions make very clear is that you can only share the leave with one person, one of this list. You cannot share it with just anybody. And so there's again a list of individuals that wouldn't be eligible, like a sibling, an aunt, an uncle, basically people that you can't get married to under the provision. So that's one way of just bearing in mind what the provisions provide for. So I recently had a question from a client about whether a single mother would be able to share some of the parental leave with her mother. Well, under the provisions, as you can see, the answer to that is no, because that's not an eligible relationship in this context. So the mechanics now. I've identified who is eligible, who qualifies. How do I actually go about, as a mother, ending my maternity leave, starting my shared parental leave, and notifying the employer? What information will you get? There are two types of notices under the new regulations. The first is the actual notice to confirm that what I'm doing is ending my maternity leave and opting into the shared leave provisions. And that's a notice that both parents will have to give to their own employer. There's no requirement and no obligation on the two employers, assuming both are employed, to swap notices or to get confirmation. If I'm employing the mother, I'm not required to get confirmation from the partner or the partner's employer. Obligations aren't that as stringent as that. It's down to a self-declaration provision. But that's actually the notice to opt into shared parental leave. There's a different set of requirements attached to notice that has to be given by a parent when they are actually going to take the leave. So notifying the employer of the actual dates that I'm going to take as part of my shared leave entitlement. Because bear in mind, as I've said, individuals, they might notify you that they're going to opt into the regime and they're going to take, let's say they share 25 weeks each. They may take those 25 weeks in one go, or they might actually decide to take initially 20 weeks, come back to work, and then take another 5 weeks later on. So there's a different notice that you get confirming the time off that's being booked. Let's just deal with the opt-in notice. This is the notice that tells you I'm ending the maternity leave, I'm ending the maternity pay, and opting into the shared parental leave. So your employee will provide this to you. They'll confirm the economic activity test. They'll get their partner to sign that by way of confirmation, and they will sign the notification as well. That opt-in notice will tell you exactly how much leave they're going to share, and indeed what amount of leave each of them is going to take. It will also, because there's a pay entitlement here, there's an entitlement to shared parental pay, they will also tell you which or how they're going to allocate between them the shared parental pay. So you'll get quite a lot of information on that one notification. It is, as I say, really a curtailment notice, because what's happening is the mother is bringing her maternity leave to an end probably at some point in the future. And she may say to you, I'm going to end my maternity leave in a month's time. I'm going to take another 4 weeks, and then I'm going to share the rest of my leave, and this is how we're going to allocate the weeks between us. The other thing just to say is there's no stringent entitlement as to when that notice can be given. It can be given quite a long way into the maternity leave itself. But once it has been given to you and you've been notified of this opt-in, it will become binding after 8 weeks. So there is an ability to vary that, but only in very limited circumstances. There's an overarching ability to vary with both the parent and the mother's consent, and there are some circumstances where there's a recognition that some mothers may actually try and give notice to opt in early but then change their mind. So I'll come back to both of those exceptions in a moment. So you've got the opt-in notice. It's told you how much leave they're sharing. It's told you what number of weeks each of them is going to take. It's given you the partner's name, national insurance number, and confirmed they meet the earnings test. You may actually, within 14 days, ask from your employee that they provide you with details of their partner's employer and address. You don't have to do that, but you do have that option. And I think just be a little bit careful while you're designing your policies and thinking about your approach here, because you need to think carefully about whether you're going to ask for that additional information and indeed what you're going to do with it, and if as a matter of course you're going to be following up and approaching the other employer. You have no requirement and obligation to do that. In the opt-in notice also, the individual employee will tell you when they are planning to take their leave. Now, it's an early heads up. It's not a binding notice of when I intend to take the leave. But the idea behind it is that by giving you that indication early on, it may be you can start an early discussion with your employee, and particularly because this is going to be a dialogue between the two parents. If their partner's employer begins to indicate that some of the plans are going to be disruptive, it may be they come back and have another discussion with you because they want to obviously coordinate the absence, and they may want to change their initial intentions. So it's a non-binding notice. Now, I mentioned that there are limited circumstances in which that opt-in notice, that intention to take shared leave, can be changed. It's binding after 8 weeks. There may be some unfortunate circumstances where everything in the garden was rosy, that the parents had agreed that they were going to share the leave, and then perhaps there's a relationship breakdown or something happens with the care of the child and one parent decides that they need to take primary responsibility. They can only vary that allocation. Let's say they agreed they were going to take 25 weeks each. They can only vary that later with the consent of both parties. So there has to be agreement between both individuals. And if they do vary that eligibility or opt-in notice, then if they have already booked some leave, again, they have no entitlement to actually change the allocation, in particular, of leave they've already booked, although you may, as an employer, decide to allow them to do that and to be more flexible and apply some discretion. So there are some strict limitations to these provisions, but that won't prevent an employer actually being more flexible and more generous and allow some changes. Where there is a variation of that shared allocation or that opt-in notice, when you're booking leave, the provisions say you can book up to 3 occasions or vary and book for up to 3 occasions. A variation to change the shared element doesn't count towards those 3 occasions, and that's quite helpful. There was also a recognition that some mothers may give very early notice that they wanted to end their maternity leave and opt for shared leave. But if they did so too early, plans may change. And so there is one very special provision which allows a mother, if they have given that opt-in notice before they give birth, to actually vary that as long as they do so within 6 weeks of the birth. So there's a window of time that's built in where they've given very early notice before the birth of the baby. And also in the event of the death of the mother or the partner, that's also a circumstance in which a variation can be made to the allocation. There are also some special provisions around notifying you that I want to take shared parental leave at upon the birth, immediately on arrival of the baby, and there's some recognition that can be done, and you don't need to give the 8 weeks notice because obviously that's not practical, but you will be able to give notice as an individual that that's when you want to take some of your initial shared leave. So let's move on to booking the leave. I've already notified you of how much leave I'm planning to take over the course of the child's first year. I now want to actually book some of that time off. So the notice to take the leave has to be given at least 8 weeks before the leave starts. So it's an 8-week notification, and I will tell you when I want to take that leave, at least 8 weeks hence, and how much of the leave I want to take. I can only take the leave in blocks of whole weeks, and there is a provision that says an employer may agree to be more flexible, may allow me to take not just a whole block, but actually what's called discontinuous leave. So actually not a whole stretch of, let's say, 3 weeks out, which once an individual's given you the 8 weeks notice, you cannot negotiate on. By law, I'm entitled to take that time off, unless actually I agree with you, and by mutual agreement, I agree to a change. But if I've given you notice of a different type of leave, what's called discontinuous leave, then you can, as an employer, you can veto discontinuous leave. And what I mean by that is, I may give you notification that I want to take 1 week's leave, let's say, in May, and then another week in June, and another week in July next year. That's a discontinuous leave period that I'm taking. The legal provisions say if that is not acceptable to you as an employer, there's a 2-week discussion period. You can either agree or disagree. But if you cannot live with that, it's too disruptive to the business, then actually the individual has no right to take discontinuous leave. What they will have is the option to either withdraw the notice of discontinuous leave, and then they can put in another request. If they withdraw by the 15th day, because there's a 2-week window to discuss it, then remember I said they've got 3 requests and booking leave they can make. It doesn't count towards their 3. And if they withdraw by the 15th day, it doesn't count, so they haven't lost one of their 3 lives, if you like. If they don't do that, what happens is the leave actually reverts to a single block, which in this case would be 3 weeks, because that was the original period that they had notified you of, and it will start either on the date that they first notified you of the first period they wanted, that first week in May, or they can actually opt for a different start date. So it is quite narrow in terms of what type of leave and the patterns that can be taken. So when an individual gives you 8 weeks notification of the leave they want to take, as I say, unless it's discontinuous or unless you agree it's a binding period, they're entitled to that time off. What they can do, however, is give you, as you can see here, 8 weeks notice of the fact they want to change a leave that they'd already booked. If they do that, however, it will count towards their 3. So they're narrowing the scope for future requests, and that's an important consequence for them. Again, there's nothing to stop an employer being more flexible than this. Nothing to stop an employer saying, I'm not going to limit it to the 3 occasions. So, for example, there may be a scenario where I've booked the leave, I'm about to take some time off, and actually the employer approaches me and says, we've now got a really important client meeting. Will you actually curtail your leave? Would you be willing to come in and not take that last week? That's a variation, but you probably wouldn't want to have that count towards the 3 occasions, because I'm accommodating and working with you in that respect. And as I've already touched on, these are the provisions around discontinuous leave. You can request it as an individual. There's a 2-week discussion period. There's agreement, disagreement. But if you won't agree it as the employer, then it reverts to a single block. So there are some limitations around it. And I think, as I've already said, you can be more flexible than the stringent 3 occasions and notification provisions. Just want to move on to talk a little bit about the pay provisions that apply here, because we've talked a lot about the mechanics. The pay provisions are 37 weeks of shared parental pay, and it's all at the flat rate. So it's all at the statutory flat rate, and the parents will confirm when they give you their opt-in notice how they want to allocate the pay between them. And you can see it's the same eligibility test for the pay as for SMP. So you may have situations where individuals are entitled to shared parental leave but not entitled to shared parental pay. Equally, you may have situations where one of the parents is entitled to the leave and pay but the other isn't, because either they don't meet the qualifying 26-week service with their employer or they don't meet the earnings threshold. Just 2 final areas to touch on, which is about what happens while the individual is absent on shared leave and their right to return. So it mirrors the maternity provisions. The contract continues with the exception of pay, and they return to work with their full continuity of service and full seniority. The right to return is to return to the same job as when they left, where they have been absent for up to 26 weeks in aggregate. And the reason I'm using that language, 26 weeks in aggregate, is again because there's this stop-start pattern, taking some shared parental leave, coming back to work. For any of those periods of absence, together with maternity leave and paternity leave and adoption leave, you look at it, what's the total? If it's 26 weeks, it's a right to return to the same job. Even if it's more than 26 weeks in aggregate, it is still, of course, a right to return to the same job unless it's not reasonably practicable, in which case they have a right to return to a role that's suitable and on no less favourable terms and conditions. The other provision that has been read across from the maternity provisions to shared leave is around the right to return in a redundancy situation. But again, it's a bit more complicated. So you know that those on maternity and other leave, if their job becomes redundant whilst they're absent on maternity leave, they have the right of first refusal. They have the right to be offered a suitable alternative vacancy in a redundancy situation ahead of others. And that is what we have in effect introduced to those taking shared parental leave, this right to preferential treatment. Of course, the difficulty is it doesn't apply to one stretch of absence, so it's a bit more difficult to manage. And of course, this is on top of the no detriment and unfair dismissal provisions. What the government have done in the regs is to say that if I take shared paternity leave, shared parental leave, I will have the right to suitable alternative employment if during the period when I'm taking shared parental leave, it's not practicable for me to come back to my job because of redundancy. That is not as easy a concept as it might seem at first blush. So the right arises where the job becomes redundant whilst I'm taking shared parental leave. So an individual may take shared parental leave at some point after my job has been identified as redundant, i.e. I've been given notice and then I've taken shared parental leave. Well, during that notice period, of course, because my job's become redundant, it might not be practicable for me to return to that same job. So I do have this priority right, and individuals might seek to take some shared parental leave if they think their job is under threat. So that's an important factor. If I take some shared parental leave and my job is declared redundant and then I come back, I might still carry that priority right if a suitable job arises later, even though I'm back in the workplace. So it does create some difficulties and some complexities, and to help manage the situation and make it easier, I think allowing discontinuous leave could just complicate this picture even further. Final areas on enhanced maternity pay. Do you have to extend to those taking shared paternity leave the right to the same rights to enhanced maternity pay? The BIS guidance will say very clearly no. They don't regard it as at all a risk of discrimination. There is an exception under the Equality Act that says that where you are giving special treatment to those who are pregnant or have recently given birth, that is permissible and can't be used to run a discrimination case by someone that doesn't get that benefit. But bear in mind that is an exception that applies for special treatment only where the treatment can be shown to be proportionate, and proportionate to meet the aim of protecting the individual who is pregnant or has recently given birth. There may be some case law on this. We are anticipating potential complaints from individuals, but the strict position from BIS is they're saying no, it doesn't mean that you have to extend enhanced maternity pay. I anticipate that we may get individuals trying to raise concerns or complaints about it, and you need to think carefully about what you want to do in terms of enhancing or not enhancing shared pay, and how you do that where you've got individuals stopping and starting periods of absence. Again, it's not like a maternity leave provision with a very clear end date and a return to work bonus that applies on one occasion. So I'm going to hand back now to Rob, having taken you through that detailed, I hope, overview of how the framework will operate.
Thank you so much, Audrey. There's certainly a lot to think about, and thanks for taking us through it in such a clear way. Okay, before we hear from Camilla, we're going to run another poll, and this one looks at that topic that Audrey just raised, and that's around enhanced maternity pay and whether or not you think you might mirror that in some way for shared parental pay. So the question is, will you enhance shared parental pay beyond statutory requirements? And then there's 7 options. I know there's quite a lot of options there. Have a look at the one that you think you're closest to. we begin at the top with those that say yes, we're basically going to mirror what we offer women with enhanced maternity pay. We're going to offer that to fathers as well, or partners. Yes, we're going to enhance it, but we won't mirror it. There's a big one that obviously says don't know, and then there's you can choose in the opposite direction. And right at the bottom, if you don't enhance maternity pay anyway, then I guess this doesn't really apply to you. So you can vote that. Now, most people have voted already, so let's skip to the results and see what people are saying. Okay, so most people don't know. That's what we expected. There's a big chunk of people who are saying that they don't enhance maternity pay anyway, and then we've got sort of 6-7% at either camp that are basically going to say then they will mirror enhanced pay, or they don't want to change their enhanced maternity pay, and they won't enhance shared parental pay. Okay, well it's an interesting area, and this is a fairly it's quite a difficult thing, and a lot of companies are still making up their minds. So let's move on to Camilla's presentation now. Camilla is Chief Executive of YESS. Over to you, Camilla.
Thank you. I think the big question is whether the introduction of shared parental leave means there will be more sharing of caring, and also whether it will reduce the existing pay gap, which widens considerably at the time when women become parents, and whether it will reduce the stereotype of women as primary carers and so less committed to work. There is some interesting research which shows that the gender pay gap for men and women in their 20s has almost disappeared. But the impact of having children still has a significant impact on parents' wages. The earning prospects of women who postpone having children has improved, but not for those women who don't postpone having children, in other words, have them at a younger age. Now, the motherhood pay penalty has declined slightly, but still, mothers born in 1970 can expect to earn 26% less than the average father. By contrast, interestingly, fathers earn more than if they had not had children, so there's a fatherhood bonus. And the motherhood pay penalty is strongest in countries with policies and cultural values that support the ideal of male breadwinner and female home worker. So I think that the new shared parental scheme will possibly make a difference. I think the other really interesting statistic is that 30% of all working mothers with dependent children are now the primary earners for their family, so that they earn the same as or more than their partners. And this increases, as probably you'd expect, for women with degree-level qualifications, where 35% are the main earners. But even despite the fact that many more women are the main earners, they still face significant barriers to entering and remaining in work. Partly lack of flexible working, partly cost of childcare, but also the gendered nature of parental leave. So will parental leave make a difference? Well, we've had additional paternity leave for quite a while. Under 1% of fathers have taken it. Now, will it be different now? It's shared parental leave can be taken much earlier and it's more flexible. There is some employers think that there will be a higher take-up. The government estimates that the take-up is going to be between 2 and 8%. But a lot, I think, will depend on whether statutory pay is offered. And there is a lot of evidence that shows that fathers take leave if at replacement pay. There is a difference in whether you are a manager or not a manager, because male managers rarely take more than 2 weeks leave, and the more senior a manager is, the less supportive of the leave. So one asks, is there a link between managers taking leave and their attitude to the people they manage taking it? So the big question is whether equality in leave will lead to equality in practice. My view is that it will improve slowly, particularly where employers see shared parental leave as an opportunity rather than a difficult challenge. And it probably looks like rather a difficult challenge at the moment, but I think we'll all get used to it. A recent survey by Expert HR of 350 employers showed 72% of employers favour shared parental leave. I think there's a lot of concern about arranging cover, particularly for discontinuous periods of leave, and quite a lot of confusion there. But there may be times when it could be an advantage if the leave and return to work can fit in with work peaks and troughs. And I think what is really important, as Audrey has touched on, is there should be a discussion between employers and employees about what might work. And whatever the legal provisions are, no one wants to get into a legal wrangle which might harm the working relationship. The positive side is obviously that if fathers do take shared parental leave, mothers can continue to be more engaged with work during the first year. And evidence shows that the longer the absence, the weaker the link with the workplace. So what happens at the moment a lot is that women on maternity leave are invisible, so miss out, for example, on promotion opportunities. However, the other unknown is whether fathers will take the leave because they fear being marginalised for taking it, and will fear being on a daddy track in the same way as mothers fear the mummy track. So I think it's going to be very difficult to predict, and I hope that employers who provide enhanced maternity pay won't move too quickly to reduce that in order to be able to afford shared parental pay, because I think we need to wait and see how many fathers will actually take advantage. I'd just like to finish by saying that employers who see shared parental leave as an opportunity will be, I think, employers of choice, like those who embrace flexible working practices with all the business benefits that this brings, such as talent retention. There's a lot of evidence that employees are increasingly putting work-life balance high on their agenda. It may not be top of the agenda because pay is probably top, but it certainly is much more important than it has been for all employees, men and women, than it has been in the past. So I think there are many more questions than answers there, and I think that we won't know what's going to happen for at least probably a year. Thank you.
Thank you, Camilla. Thank you very much. Okay, interesting to get an understanding there of some of the sort of trends and the considerations that employers need to make. When we published a story on this topic in May on Personnel Today, which actually suggested the idea that not offering enhanced shared parental pay could be seen as discriminatory in some way. We had quite a few reactions to that, and one comment beneath the article said that basically shared parental leave is going to be no different to additional paternity leave, i.e. no one's going to take it up, while the other one I think suggested that this could be the biggest change in gender equality in the UK ever. I think that was what they were suggesting. Anyway, we've got about 10 minutes for questions, so I'm going to go to the floor now essentially and pick some of the questions that have been asked most frequently. We've had 100 or so questions through. Quite a few questions about keeping in touch days. Do these remain? Is there any obligation to offer paid keeping in touch days? Audrey, perhaps if I can ask you that.
Yes. Well, let's start first of all with what's happening with keep in touch days. So individuals will retain the, where they're absent on maternity leave, the KIT days that they currently have, which I think is 10 under the current regime. Those taking shared parental leave will also have, on top of that, it's not as bad as it sounds, however, up to 20, they've called them split days, so keeping in touch when they're off on shared parental leave. But two things to bear in mind. Firstly, KIT or split days are arranged by agreement between employer and individual, and very relatively few days are used in that allowance. And the second point is it allows an individual to come back to work. It doesn't interrupt their leave and their statutory pay, but there's no obligation on an employer to pay. That's a matter of agreement, and usually, obviously, a sensible amount is agreed. So there's no compulsion around those provisions.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we've got a question from Jane now. What is the risk if we refuse all requests for multiple periods of leave? Audrey, to you again.
Well, I think there's a short-term risk, which is that, let's go back to my example. Let's say I ask for discontinuous leave. I ask for 2 weeks in May, 2 weeks in June, 2 weeks in July, and you say no, and that's the response that always happens. I think there's not a risk because there's a lack of consistency, but what I could do is I can force that pattern on you anyway, because what I will do is just issue 8 weeks notice to take the leave, the 2 weeks in May, 8 weeks to take it in June, and 8 weeks in July. Now, I have a problem as the individual if I do that because I've used up my 3 allowances. But I think it's more a practical issue in terms of a risk. I don't see that an individual can complain because you're entitled to under the statutory provisions. If you're always refusing it, obviously you need to be a bit careful about discrimination rights and those you might agree and those you might not agree to. But really it's more a practical issue about the more you can cooperate, discuss and agree these periods of absence, the better you can manage the business and accommodate individuals. So it's more a risk of, I think, culture and trying to get cooperation.
Okay, thank you. One for Camilla, perhaps this one. This is from John. He says that he works in a manufacturing environment. They employ 85% men, but do offer strong maternity benefits to their female employees. What should we do? And then he goes on to say that the finance director's not very keen on this. Camilla, any ideas there? I mean, clearly, if they match enhanced maternity benefits to all the men in the company, it could cost a fortune.
Yes, I think it's obviously, as I said, very difficult to predict how many men are going to take the time off. And I do think that because only 1% took the additional paternity leave, it's likely to have a very slow start. So I think that employers may be advisable to wait and see what does happen, and perhaps implement a policy where there is some enhanced shared parental leave, but review it a year later. I suspect that still very few men will actually take it, because the evidence is that men don't take it unless there is really full replacement pay. Okay.
All right. Now here's a very practical one from Joanne, who works in a school. Can we do anything to prevent teachers from returning to work for a school holiday and then restarting their parental leave at the beginning of term? Audrey, one for you.
Sorry, could you repeat the question, Rob?
Okay, so Joanne works in a school. Can we do anything to prevent teachers from returning to work for the period of a school holiday and then going back on shared parental leave at the beginning of a term?
provided the individual has actually given the required 8 weeks notice, the periods of leave aren't negotiable. So they book the leave, they've given the 8 weeks notice. Other than trying to agree the arrangements, actually they start with a strict entitlement of it's as long as it's not discontinuous leave that they're seeking, and as long as they're within their 3 allowances, they have the right to book and take the leave subject to the notice and the qualifying provisions, of course.
Right. Okay. A question from Susan. What about the circumstances when a man has fathered children with 2 different women with the estimated expected week of childbirth on or after the 5th of April? Can he, in effect, have 2 sets of shared parental leave? That comes back to the economic test, doesn't it, Audrey?
It does. I mean, let's assume that the father in question with the 2 newborns has been employed for 26 weeks and meets the and their part. Each of the mothers meets the economic activity test. He can get shared parental leave if both mothers agree to share it in respect of their child. So it applies per child to the nominated partner of the mother. So in that situation, the individual would be strictly entitled to take shared leave in relation to each of those 2 babies.
Okay. Right, we are running out of time, I'm afraid. There's a slide on the screen at the moment just showing some of the resources that are available on Personnel Today and Expert HR, including Expert HR's latest research that looks into maternity and paternity pay and leave arrangements as they stand at the moment, but also asking and reporting on some research around shared parental pay and what organisations are thinking of around that topic. One more question I think perhaps we've got time for, because it does come up a lot, and I guess we should just clarify it. Just to talk about expected week of childbirth, because I've had lots and lots of questions about various situations where perhaps the baby's born very early, or the baby's born very late, or there's an emergency C-section, and so on. Audrey, if you could just clarify who will qualify in relation to the date.
Yes. So it's really the way to think about this new regime is it applies to by reference to the baby and the baby's expected week. So if the baby's expected week is on or after the 5th of April, the parents potentially could benefit from the new regime, provided they meet the service and earnings requirements. If the child is due on or after the 5th of April, but let's say arrives as early as beginning of March, then that's still a baby whose parents benefit from the shared parental leave. Individuals who are having babies due before the 5th of April will remain under the current regime, which will become the old regime, which is additional paternity leave, which is the swapped leave. So that regime, although it's being repealed, it's not being guillotined, because there will be babies and parents of babies prior to the 5th of April that will continue potentially to benefit from that regime.
Thank you very much, Audrey, and thank you, Camilla. I'm afraid we are out of time now, so I do hope that everybody found today's webinar useful. As you can see, it is a complicated topic, so do look out for further resources on Personnel Today and Expert HR. Look at personneltoday.com/webinars as well to look at our online archive of on-demand webinars on various topics, including flexible working, which went up last month. And as you leave today's webinar, please answer a couple of the questions relating. We've got some specific questions on shared parental leave and also some general questions on feedback for today's webinar. Okay, it leaves me to thank our guests, Camilla Palmer and Audrey Williams. Thank you both for your presentations and for your answers in the Q&A. You've been listening to a Personnel Today webinar in association with Expert HR, and that's all from me, Rob Moss. Goodbye.